Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. This week on the show, I have Mykolas Rambus from Hush with me for what just might be the most important conversation you've heard in a while for your modern financial advisory business. Now, I know that's a bold claim, but here's the deal. We're going to be talking about helping you work with your clients to keep their personal information private and secure in a day and age where it's shockingly easy for bad actors and sadly pretty easy for average Joes to get access to information about your wealthy clients that could put their finances, personal safety, and reputations at risk. And that's where Mykolas and the Hush team come to the rescue. Trust me, you are going to be really happy you listened to or watched this episode. Now, before we get rolling, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Amazon, the YouTubes, or wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. And if you have a question or a suggestion for a topic or a guest, hit me up. I'm basically at Mike Langford everywhere on the internet, or you can shoot me an email, podcast@finservmarketing.com. Okay, let's get to the conversation with Mykolas Rambus. Well, Mykolas Rambus, welcome to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. So wonderful to see you this morning.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled. And you know, like I said, right before our technical difficulties here, I've been looking forward to this episode of the show, having you on the show ever since we met at the Changing Landscape of the Wealth Management Industry conference here in Austin, Texas. It was put on by University of Texas. I saw you speak. I'm like, I got to get this guy on the show. And we had to jump through a few hoops of schedule rechanges and what have you to get you here. But I'm really appreciative that you stuck with it and got on the show.
No, I'm pleased. And as you know, look, I try to share what we know as often as I can, but there's never a dull moment in this world, unfortunately.
It is true. It's funny. You know, I was thinking about this. You know, I sent over, and we've got some conversation starters teed up. I sent over this outline doc as I do with every guest. But I was actually thinking about this last night. It's so funny how like you think about your next day, you know, as you're falling asleep and you're like, oh, I can't wait to talk to Mykolas about this stuff. And then I'm like, you know, one thing I want to talk to him about is like, how do we deliver this type of conversation without making people too anxious? And it's kind of a weird thing. You know what I mean? Like I want them to be cognizant and alert of technology threats, you know, or digital threats or whatever you would call it. But I also don't want to like make people like completely paranoid and scared to live their lives. So I think maybe we'll talk about that a little bit here today. But maybe we can kick things off with kind of an exploration of the scale of the average high net worth client's digital footprint, because I think that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about. This we don't really think about the scale of our footprint too often, but of all the people I've ever met, I think you might be the person most uniquely positioned to paint this picture of just what information is out there about our clients and the folks in our audience, for the folks in our audience, excuse me.
Indeed. So I've played both sides, right?
Yeah.
You know, at WealthX, this is all we did, right? We built dossiers on, you know, very wealthy individuals and their families and people who think that they are private, that they don't have much information out there. They really take pains to not be seen. The reality is there's still a lot of information out there about them, if you know where to look.
Yeah.
And so the average individual, right, has something like 212 links out there about them. Now, not all of those are what we call vulnerabilities, but this might be information about kids, home addresses, where they went to school, all things that build a picture of an individual.
Wow, that's great. It is fast. 212 links. And so it just boggles my mind. You don't think about it when you're going about your day. You're just doing stuff. And a lot of that stuff is online, right? Whether, you know, if you look at the average person, I don't care what their economic background is, they're staring at their phone a lot. You know? So let's dive into a little bit about it. Like, you know, when you were at WealthX, and this is actually a really interesting one to take people through, like what was WealthX and what made you decide to start that back in the day?
So I was at Forbes previously,
Yeah.
looking around at the wealth management industry in 2010 and seeing what was missing. There was so much talk of growth. There was so much necessity for growth in those kinds of businesses. Yeah. And yet no one had great tools, right? The state of the art, if you're a private banker, was to have literally your little black book that included names, information, background on people, and a lot of guesswork, right? Trying to look for signals of people who might have a lot of liquidity or might be coming into it soon. asking for referrals, maybe, but there wasn't much. I remember one, top bank telling us that the average net new client production for their advisors each year was less than one, right? So growing was just not part of the DNA at these organizations. And it seemed like there was a lack of information, which was a big part of that. So at WealthX, we endeavored to build the Bloomberg for private bankers, right? That was the idea. If you walked
Yeah.
into a cocktail party, or if you're at your office planning and trying to figure out who's in your area, you should get to know that there was some kind of data set, right, that you could look at and learn from. Not to be creepy. This was all based on publicly available information.
Right.
First thing I say, right, not to be creepy, but all based on publicly available information. So no dumpster diving, no talking to ex partners and the rest, but all things that were gathered above board. And even then at WealthX, there were pieces of data that we left out of the dossiers, right? We did not include information about minor children, didn't include contact details like phone numbers or emails, even though we got asked all the time. So we tried to leave things out that would either pose a security risk or just didn't feel right from an ethical perspective. Those stayed out of the dossier, but they were, as mentioned by name, right? A dossier to get background about an individual, 5-7 pages of detailed content. Most people, I'd say actually half, have Googled themselves, right? If they do, they almost never go past page 2 or 3, right? There is so much more out there. And Google by no means is exhaustive. It's only indexing something like 15% of the searchable web. There are so many other places to find information, and people just don't know that.
Yeah. And much of this information, and I think we'll dive into this, some of this information, even though Google's not popping it up to page 1 or 2 or even 3, it is still public information, right? Like, as a great example, like property records, as an example, you can find out who owns a particular piece of property if you're looking to find out who owns that house or who owns that building or whatever. Usually you can find it out. Other things like marriage certificates and so forth. A lot of this stuff is like strangely public, but it's fascinating. I love that you took the initiative. You hit on 2 notes here that I think are really interesting. One, the anemic organic growth in our industry is a real deal. It really is, and it still is a deal. And the fact that you identified a mechanism and that was able to help people, better go about bringing on new clients. But this is also something that I think I and many others have talked to firms about, just saying, hey, listen, before you meet with a client or you talk to a prospect, you should do a little research on them. Do a tiny bit of social research to learn a little bit about them so that when you do get that meeting, there's a little familiarity there. Whether they like to travel or what, if they're into fast cars or other type of cool stuff, or whatever. But this is a little bit deeper. So it's really kind of fascinating. What was the effort you had to go about to do this type of stuff like this? Because I think that sets another stage for like what we're going to be talking about, hush and some cybersecurity. What level of effort to dig for this information? Is this something that anybody could have done if they just took the time and you just systematized it, or is it like it took a lot more heavy lifting?
A lot more than we thought. Okay. Let's certainly say that, right?
Yeah.
Can anyone be trained? Can train to do it? Yes. The issue is knowing where to look. Like you said, you can find out from property records where someone might have residences, but you've got to know which databases to turn to. Same thing for marriage records, same thing for voting records.
Yeah.
2,500 data brokers that exist in the US have made that easier, I will say, right? A lot of those data brokers, for expression, hoover up all that information and make it searchable on either public websites or behind a paywall. So that's part of it. Also knowing to look on social media, knowing to look not only for the individual and their own, perhaps their own profile, but that of their friends and their family is another. We often say the way to crack the case on, a CEO isn't through the CEO. It's through their spouse or partner, their teenage kids, right? It's a service provider, the art dealer. I mean, you'd be shocked at the information that's out there. One of the ones that always blows my mind from a physical safety security perspective is designers and architects. It's so many times unbeknownst to the clients themselves, they'll take the pictures of the work and the home and everything else and post those as examples on their website. Happens all the time, right? And those are real security risks these days. But to answer your question, it was complicated. It would take us a few days in the beginning to do those dossiers well. We often knew that this was not only a banker reading this, but it could well be the head of the bank who's also reading that going into a discussion. So it needed to be highly curated, high quality editorial product. And to make sure it was spot on, it needed 3 days. Now, we eventually got that down to a day, eventually got that down to 8 hours with technology, but it still was and is an involved process.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's not like, well, technically it could if they get the time they have, but it's not like, your average, 19-year-old kid is like, guess what? I'm going to do all this research on you, but the information's there. So it's really interesting. So you said you were at Forbes, you started WealthX, that was 2010. And now you've recently launched in the last few years, Hush. So one theme that I see that's consistent across this is that you were focused on serving wealthy folks or the people who want to serve wealthy folks, right?
Yes.
High net worth individuals or people who are in positions of power, I would say, or a certain status that would want them to better understand the people who are around them or the people they're serving, or understand their own security threats. So what was it that you saw in your travels before that made you decide, hey, I need to start Hush? Like, this is a thing that needs to be, like, this is the next thing that Mykolas is going to do.
So this is where it got personal, right? Certainly. So
Okay.
here we are at WealthX, building this database of the world's wealthiest people and getting some notoriety, which is great, right? I think, a lot of people in the industry know the brand. And eventually we had spies, right? Intelligence from different European countries come our way and try to get access to our database because they were looking for cross-border tax cheats, right? And you can imagine the amount of money that flows out of Western European countries into some of the banks there. And so we said no, right? We politely declined, not who we're going to sell to. We knew what that would mean for our market as a group that served private banks. And when you say no to intelligence agencies, one's aware that they may have other methods, right? And so that certainly raised our hackles as a management team. Then we had some oligarchs, and not the nicer ones, right? Who
Right.
learned that their profiles were in WealthX and wanted them deleted, and we said no, we can't do that, right? Not part of our process. It's publicly available information. You never want to tell an oligarch no, right? If you've dealt with them before. And then lastly, we had organized crime through proxy companies try to buy access to our database. I think that was the last
Interesting.
straw, recognizing some very concerning groups who were trying to get access and recognizing we were saying no to all of them. So with that in mind, well, how do we manage our own footprint? How do we reduce the information out there about ourselves and our families? And the answer was there was no tool, right? So we turned to people in law enforcement globally. We turned to journalists who cover sensitive areas of the world or sensitive individuals. And they had nothing, right? There was no best practice, no tool set. And that was the light bulb moment for Hush is can we
Interesting.
build that thing which actually does the job of giving someone real privacy?
It is a genius idea. Again, every once in a while you see something, you're like, what the hell took so long for this, right? I come across that every once in a while. And that's one of the things I love about this space is I've been doing this for like 30 years and been in the wealth management space. And you just come across something like, no way, this should have existed a long time ago, right?
Yes.
How does one go about deciding? I mean, you talked through your decision matrix process, but like, okay, what do we need to do to be able to implement something like this, something like Hush? Like, what kind of stuff do we need to be able to do to go out and make people aware of what information is out there, and I think B, one of the things that you got everybody's attention in the room when you said this, and I'm going to paraphrase, you said, Hush we are the eraser for the internet. And I think everybody in the room is like, oh, I need to hear what comes next. Like, so how does one go about going, okay, we're going to create the eraser for the internet? What was your process of like, and I don't have to take me through every bit of the startup process, but I kind of geek out on this stuff. Like what did it look like?
Yeah. So first thing is can we do it? Right.
Yeah.
So we went through a long R&D process. It was fun pulling the band back together, right?
Yeah.
From WealthX, certainly in this new business. And then just assembling that table to say, okay, well, how do we do it? Right. This, fast forward, we sold WealthX in 2014, right? So technology's evolved, thankfully. Processing and compute and all through the geeking out stuff of making this work well at scale have improved. So can we actually do it? Can we build an engine that finds out everything about a given individual on the internet? Can we somehow segment that out into things that put them at risk? Because look, it's nice to have the information at large, but look, no one's got time, right? I mean, we may talk about this, but who's actually going to act on it? So we made to make this really easy for the user to click through. And once we've done that, okay, can we actually remove it? Can we erase it from the internet? And what does that take, by the way?
Yeah.
At this moment in legislation in the United States, which is a patchwork, by the way, of privacy laws. I mean, it's a mess. Hopefully,
Yeah.
Congress acts on it in a more comprehensive way, but right now it's a mess. So, can we actually build this thing? The answer was yes. Right, 6 months of R&D later, and we believe it can be done. Need to go get investment. Need to grow this thing. But yeah, there's a path.
It's funny. The next logical question for me is, well, who's the first customer for this? Is like, I definitely want to use it. Let's try it out. Go get my private information and tell me if you can fix it or whatever. So maybe some of your investors are like, hey, listen, I'm ultra high net worth. I'm investing in stuff like this. Wipe my stuff or let me know where my threats are.
Yeah. So good news, right? Relationships as they are. I was an entrepreneur in residence at Dan Gilbert's venture capital fund, Detroit Venture Partners, which is where we're based here in Detroit. So Dan is a billionaire. That's no secret, right? And being a billionaire comes with all the other billionaire risks. And we're able to work and start that process under that umbrella. And that's a great place to begin, right? Because in some ways, yes, we are an eraser, of course, but we're also, in a lot of ways, democratizing what has not existed except for billionaires. Right. So, yes, you could go to a law firm and hire people at whatever per hour, former 3-letter agency folks to do this manually. And you'll easily spend, 10, 20,000, 30,000 for a one-time solution. How can we distill this down? Right. So that was great learning early days. But you're right. Early days was single family offices, ultra high net worth individuals, asset managers, private equity, hedge funds, right? Because high concentrations of wealth, concerns about privacy, and wanting to get it solved and able to act quickly. So that's how we started this business, is working with those kinds of groups. Now we've since grown and evolved in other directions, but a lot of it is around, right, that same wealth community that you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. So let's dive into some kind of, I would call it action item-y type stuff. What are the key things that financial advisors, whether they're private office types or just regular high net worth and office advisory firms that maybe serve a few ultra high net worth folks, what do they need to know about cybersecurity for the clients? I guess for the clients and frankly maybe for themselves, right? For their firms too. Is you are a vector potentially for cybersecurity threats for your clients and also for your own firm survival as well. So what are some of the key things they need to know?
Yeah. So first thing is not to be intimidated by the idea. I think, people who don't live in cybersecurity, they hear the word and they assume it's cloak and dagger and black box and all this other stuff. And yeah, there are parts of that. But the reality is, for most people, cybersecurity is less about devices and home networks and the rest. That's important, but less about it. Most of the criminality that happens today when it comes to cybersecurity begins and often ends with social engineering or phishing, right? This is someone researching somebody, figuring out a scam, and getting through to them. In fact, there's this now pretty visible story about a financial advisor, right, who was sadly schemed out of $50,000. And if you listen to sort of the audio out there or her comments, it's all about someone creating a confidence scam, right? And finding their way to get her to cough up that $50,000. So when you think about from an advisor perspective, cybersecurity, most of it starts and stops with these issues around social engineering and phishing. And yeah, it's good to know, okay, do I have latest devices and update and the rest? Sure. But having just some basic conversance in the topic is the key thing. Because yes, it's important from a client perspective, right? We talk about risk management, we think about wills, estate planning, and the rest. The most likely thing that any client will face with every other American is 1 out of 17 per year will have their identity stolen, right? Have their accounts drained, right? These are the calls that I get almost every week from someone who lost $500,000 of crypto because someone managed to do a SIM swap on their phone, crack in, wire the money, and it's gone, right? And so just having that familiarity as an advisor is the first step, having a perspective, or at least having someone to refer clients to on this very common topic.
Yeah, it truly is. So it's so interesting. It's probably a year or so ago. I met with a couple of guys who are working on a startup here in Austin to serve the venture capital industry first, and then they're going to try to do some other things about protecting them from wire fraud, because it's happening so frequently where even VCs who are about to write a $10 million check, wire into a startup, can be duped into wiring the money into the wrong place. And it's happened, I guess, with many CFOs or whatever have been, tricked by emails or texts that they really think is coming from the CEO and wiring money to the wrong spot. So I think it's a real issue, right? It's definitely, so it can be real numbers, I guess, is what we're talking about here. It's just like,
it's only going to worse, right? I mean, so, I'm sure most people on the call would say, well, we always do phone verification, right? That's the way we solve this problem. So, I was talking with someone today who's a substantial advisor to families. He was telling the story of someone who had been the victim of check fraud. So someone had basically actually gotten into the email of one of the client suppliers, and then changed the details for the check. So it was a physical check that was sent, not a wire in this case, but they managed to get in between it, change the details of where it was going to go, and poof, that check is gone, right? And this was tens of thousands of dollars. You mentioned the wire fraud that happens so much. Most of us are used now to phone verification, right? Let me call the person, everything else. It may seem like Hollywood. It's not that far off to be able to get in the middle of that and using AI, using voice cloning, impersonate that. We've all seen some of the other artists like Drake and everything else we impersonated. Same thing's happening for nefarious purposes.
It's crazy. So it can kind of make you paranoid, but we don't want to make people paranoid. We want to make sure that they. No, but it's true. It's like there is that weird. You want to take the appropriate protective measures, and you want to have the appropriate level of awareness so that you can be on guard and make sure you've done everything you can reasonably do to protect yourself. One of the areas that you mentioned in a prep call, but also kind of teeing up this conversation, is that a very common vector of attack is family members, right? It's not necessarily the one who's in charge of the money or running the business or what have you. What should advisors be on the lookout for, and how can they educate their clients and staff about the risks of digital attacks through family members? And I don't know, what have you found that works really well, or that do you recommend to clients?
It's a big part of it's awareness, right? Like you said, we don't be paranoid or encourage that. But I also think, look, there was good merit to the milk carton, right? Back when, certainly I was a kid, and, being aware of kidnapping and stranger danger. And, look, the numbers have shown sort of a different picture, but the reality is everyone was familiar with that, right? I often say, I wish there was a Law and Order, cyber crime edition. People would be more familiar with how these things go down, because we're just
future job for Mykolas is Hollywood producer. All right. I like it.
But there should be, right? I mean, you think about, we don't want to be paranoid, but people lock their doors, right?
Sure.
I mean, there's things that we've just learned to do, and that we're figuring out now as a society when it comes to the online space, right? We're getting there. And so for families, you're right, that's a common attack vector, as we say in the industry. It's awareness, it's having those conversations. But for an advisor, you might talk to your client about it, but the client may not know how to talk to their kids, their teenagers about it, their spouse or partner, right? It's equipping them for those conversations. So a lot of platforms create content around it. That's a great start. Certainly there's a ton of articles out there, but again, just being basically conversant in these topics and just asking the questions is so much more of a help than where we've been, sadly. Having that awareness is half the battle. Yeah,
exactly. I'm not ultra high net worth, but I imagine like some of the conversations are slightly different. Like, hey, you talk to your kids, have a healthy amount of skepticism at the beginning with new friends who just come into your orbit, right? Out of nowhere, in terms of what access you give them to security or what other information you're telling them about your life. Like, let this become a more of a gradual thing. Don't start talking to them about where you're going to be at a certain point in time and, where your mother went to high school or whatever, that type of stuff. Like, take precautions in what you share.
Absolutely. But to your point, most people don't believe that the precautions are necessary, right? They don't know that 1 out of 17 Americans has their identity stolen each year, right? They don't know that 1 out of 6 women is stalked in their lifetime, half before the age of 25, right? Wow. And so they need to think about these stats. Online, there's this very good video on Netflix called Childhood 2.0, right? Yeah. And one of the things they surface there is that for kids who are on social media, on average, kids don't know half of the people they've connected with, right, on that social media platform. So you think about, to your point, just, stranger danger awareness and so forth online. It's not a conversation that's frequent enough.
Yeah, that's an incredible point, because maybe because you're so deep in the security industry, you don't do this, but I think a lot of us have met people online, if you will, like you just, hey, like you're joining in my Twitter conversation, or you're joining in my Instagram conversation, and oh yeah, after a while, like the conversations back and forth, like I'll accept their friendship or whatever, and we're connected. But I've never met this human being before. You technically don't know if this is a real person, right?
Yes.
My friends and I always have we have the joke of the false advertising photo, right? Of like, you don't look like that. That photo is like 15 years ago of you. It's you, but you don't look like that anymore. But you're keeping that photo. Well, heck, they could say that about me. My photo is currently me before the beard, so that's only like 4 years old. But still, I still look like that. So, handsome and bald, if you're not watching on video, just like two handsome bald dudes chatting it up, just so you know. So get over in the video feed. Yeah. All right. But so, okay, I'm glad you brought that up. The whole, connecting with people you don't know on social, some of the other stats in terms of stalking and 1 in 17 having identity theft. What are some of the other new threats that you are seeing currently that maybe folks aren't aware of, but they really should be aware of, that might happen to them or is happening to others?
Yeah. So most people are familiar with the Nigerian Prince email, right?
Yeah.
The Amazon gift card scam,
Yes.
right? They know the basics, and those have gotten so common that we all have them in our view. Extortion is becoming more and more of a frequent crime because it's being scaled as a business, sadly, like so many other things. And so sextortion, right, particularly focused on teenagers and teenage boys, is a major issue. This is where someone, back to your point around who is this person that I may have connected with online, often it's positioned as, a young lady, teenage girl or otherwise, interested in a boy online on social media. But again, we know, people will be skeptical. Okay, the picture's not real, the name's not real. Look, all these things can be easily impersonated. But a young girl will reach out to a young boy, very interested online, everything else, will somehow convince the young boy to make a bad decision by sending nude photographs. And then that's where the extortion begins, right? It turns out the other person on the other end says, unless you send $2,000, $1,000, $5,000, then these pictures will be sent to all of your friends who are connected on social media, to your school, and so forth. And that's where the pressure happens. That was very rare in the past. It is expanding in frequency, again, because it's been successful, sadly, right? Because we're not having enough of these conversations with our teenagers online.
Wow.
So that's one that's common to be aware of.
My goodness.
And that's, I'd say, the one I underscore the most. The other is SIM swapping. So this is something that is, directed, right? Something like 90% of digital crimes are focused on financial gain, right? And so ultra high net worth individuals particularly are 50% more likely to be targeted. So one, it's just good to stay off the radar in the first place, so no one knows. But if it is known, then protect your cell phone, right? Many people use two-factor authentication and think that they're done, right? I'm protected, I'm safe. I have text messages that I enter into my banking details or investment account. Well, the reality is someone can intercept those if they can impersonate you to your telecommunications carrier, right? Verizon, AT&T, and so forth. And there have been some pretty big cases where lots of money's been lost that way. So go through, lock down the account at the provider, right? Add a PIN on top of the account. There are very simple things that can be done, but that is increasing in prevalence as well, especially because it seems like the carriers themselves are not being held to task, right? So there've been some lawsuits flying, and so far the carriers have managed to avoid being held reliable, responsible, which is shocking in my opinion. But nevertheless, right, that's what happens. We're on our own, right, when it comes to two-factor authentication.
It's fascinating when you think about that. The carrier, on the surface, you might go like, why would my cell phone carrier have anything to do with my true digital security and my finances? But then when you start to realize, and I say this all the time, like, hey, look, this is my financial institution right here. This cell phone that I'm holding up, my iPhone, it's connected to all of the financial accounts that I use are on this phone. And if someone had this phone and could, I guess, impersonate my face, because I have Face ID on all of them, but man, oh man, like you'd have access to everything. You could, my investment accounts, my banking accounts, right? All of my payment accounts, any type of client account I work with or whatever, all that stuff is there.
Yes.
So to what you're describing, I guess if you could swap my SIM, impersonate the SIM number there and clone my phone, I guess that's what you're getting at. You could access all
Yes.
of it.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes it happens where this phone goes dead and all of a sudden it's live somewhere else. They've already gotten the information, or it could be a clone as well. There are lots of ways that can happen. I remember chatting with someone we're helping with at Hush, who sadly did not use Hush before, right? So they found us after the fact and they came and said, look, my husband and my accounts have been drained, right? Which is a large, well-known top 5 bank institution. And they said, look, we figured out it had happened. We managed to lock everything down, change all of our passwords, work with the bank, get the funds replaced, and it happened again a week later. And we have no idea what it's. We don't know where they're getting access, how they're spying on us, or anything else. And so we took them through this process, and they hadn't recognized their phones had been cloned. To your point, right? And that's how their criminals were getting back in and getting the funds.
My gosh. That's frightening as heck. Now I'm like totally paranoid with phone. No, joking. I'll be good. So let's talk a little bit about let's go back to that phrase, the eraser for the internet, and talk about locking things down here a little bit better, being more diligent about it. And then I guess from there, I want to dive into more about your services, how Hush works, and how advisors can work with it. So how does one go about erasing information? Because when I first heard you say that, I'm like, wait a minute. I also have this other thing running around in my dome. Google never forgets. I tell my kids this all the time. Like, hey, I've got a college. Well, he just finished his freshman year, so I've got a son who just finished his freshman year in college, a daughter who just is finishing her high school freshman year, and they're at that age where sharing stuff, and I always tell them, Google never forgets. So I didn't have to deal with this when I was going to college in the 90s because photos were like regular photos. So if I was doing a keg stand, other than the people who were there, even if somebody took a photo of the keg stand, it's probably never going to see the light of day ever again. And that's, a mild thing. But all the stuff you're doing, just assume somebody's taking a photo or a video of it, and it might live forever on the internet. But let's talk a little bit about erasing some stuff. Like, what can somebody do to, I guess, lock things down? But then if things are out there and they become aware of it, what can they do to take it down in prominence or remove it completely?
Yeah. So I break it down into three buckets, right? So there are pieces of data about us that exist with data brokers, right? This is 2,500 data brokers in the US. There's a bucket around social media, right? And all of the top 18 platforms that are there. And then there's everything else, right? PDF of renovation plans or legal filing or something else of that sort. Those are the 3 buckets we've got to think about. And then certainly you have those items that would be indexed by a Google or by a Bing, and the index is still there, even if the underlying link is dead, right? That happens too. But thankfully, eventually those search engines will eliminate the index record and it will truly go away. Of those 3, data brokers all play by the rules. They may not be happy about it, but they all have a process in their T's and C's for how you can ask for information to be deleted. They make it difficult enough where no human wants to go through that process of pain and suffering, right? Of submitting these details, click on this form, and doing that 50 or 60 times, right? The average individual has 58 vulnerabilities, right? That is things that they like to have off the internet, of which a large portion of those are data brokers. Okay. Then there's social media, which again, they all have T's and C's. And social media might be something that I posted myself that was unwise. It might be an address fragment in the background of a photograph, for example. It may be something that someone posted about me on their open social media account, right? Someone doesn't like the company, and so they've doxed me. That is another term for putting my home address out there, or my phone number, or email, or information somehow about private details relating to me or my family. That's another place, right? So those social media platforms, which will comply, right? If you follow their T's and C's. And then lastly, you have everything else, right? That could be an obituary that includes way too much information about the family details, or birth announcement, or nonprofit giving announcement, right? All of those kinds of things. And that's where it's very much long tail, right? Those sites may or may not have policies, but generally speaking, most of these counterparty websites, when it comes to safety and security, they want to comply. And they don't want the risk of not complying and something bad happens to an individual. Not in the US with our litigious society, right?
Yeah.
So there is a play. It just takes the process of going through all of those. And we use something called robotic process automation to do that at scale, but that's what's required to get the information down. Almost all will comply. There's COPA, which is a privacy law around kids. There's, of course, California. There are several other states that have statutes in place. Many of the providers I described will simply go to the lowest common denominator. So if California does, they'll apply that across all 50 states. Right. So there is a framework to get these things removed. But the most important thing we say to our members, right, is try to avoid getting out there in the first place. Right. Yeah. We'll whack away at the home address as long as is needed. But if you can avoid getting it out there by putting it into a trust, then please do so. Right. Just name the trust something different than your own initials. Right. Along the way.
You mentioned that on stage, that one of the things you advise clients to do, and this is something a financial advisor could be working with the clients to do, is like when you own your primary residence in particular, putting that home in a trust. And you talked a little bit about why that's important. And I wonder if maybe you can share that here too. Like, why should somebody put their home in a trust, and how do they go about doing it?
Sure. And there are so many reasons to put it into a trust. And the reasons I would suggest for most people is the reason you can't think about. Unless they live in the space and they're worried about it every day. Again, I'll get into the reasons. The cost is usually pretty easy. You can do a quick claim deed in most states for $1,500 to put it into a trust, right? Here's another stat. 80% of burglars do their research on a property before they hit the house, right? Before they hit the target.
Wow.
And so guaranteed they're typing in the address, they're looking at property records, they're looking at the name, they're looking at the social media accounts of the family, they're looking and saying, oh, this person's going to be, they go to this school, this private school, this public school. Let me look at the school calendar for that place. Let me figure out if their friends are going to be traveling. Let me see when they're not likely to be in the home. All of these things happen day in and day out. So again, the more difficult it is for someone to be able to get any information about a home, the better. And again, that can be true for personal and physical security, but also for a whole lot of other reasons too. One of the things that's required to pull off successful identity theft is information on one's current or even past addresses, right? So if I know that you happen to have a property here, that's one of the 3 challenge questions I need to unfreeze someone's credit at one of the 3 bureaus, right? It's just painfully too easy to do. All more reasons to have it into a trust. And the cost is relatively low. Look, I'm the person who would say every jumbo mortgage in the United States should be in a trust. There's absolutely no reason to do it. And uniquely in the US, unlike other countries, is the only place you can drive down the street and type in an address and figure out who lives there. Right? It doesn't happen in Canada. It doesn't happen in certainly the UK. Definitely not Switzerland, right? Nowhere else in the world does that happen except for here in the US. And by the way, identity theft in the US is 2x as big a problem as it is anywhere else in the world.
It doesn't seem like that's so fast. I was about to ask you that follow-up question. Like, wait, does that mean that we have way more, identity theft here in the United States? And it sounds like it, and it sounds too big of a coincidence to just be, coincidental. It probably has some causal relationship. Like you said, they're typing in your address, trying to find out if you're worth stealing from. And basically,
Absolutely.
I would say that this is an interesting one too. And I think everybody who's listening or watching the show can probably relate to this. We all spend enough time on Zillow and the other property sites, right? One of the things that's pretty fascinating to me is like the details of the video. Sometimes when they're showing, you're walking through this house, you can see if there's good artwork on the wall. You can see like, the quality of the electronics or whatever. And you could just, these are multi-million-dollar houses you're walking through, to your point, and it's on the market. And chances are there might be some times this person's not there because maybe they're relo into another place. You can always tell the houses that have been staged really well. So I'm not trying to give criminals any ideas. But what I am saying is, here's another fascinating thing. If you buy a house, you should reach out to the Zillows of the world and whoever and say, can we take down the photos of the house, like the interior of the house now? Because some of them are left up there for after the fact that the house has been sold. And it's like, well, if I could do a virtual tour of the house, I could navigate the house without ever having been in it. I walk in the front door, go up here, take a right at the kitchen, and go down, whatever. So anyways, I'm not trying to give criminals any idea.
You're spot on, right? It happens more often than people would ever think. But there are 2 things I actually suggest for anyone who's selling their home. One, to write into the contract, right? So we do that cleanup for clients as well who have found that they forgot. Now we've got to go deal with whatever the realtor was to take it down. I don't want to pick any of the names, but that can be written into a contract very easily. The
Yeah.
other is a confidentiality agreement, right? In the deal with the broker. Doesn't always exist. There are lots of reasons why to have that confidentiality agreement as well. People just don't think, unless they're a celebrity, right, to do that automatically. But there's so many places where that can be extremely useful.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So let's dive into, I know we only have like another 15 minutes together at the most. And let's talk about Hush and how you work with advisors and wealth management executives. Because I think, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm so deep into this. Like I want to learn more and more and more. How does this work, and how can we work with a firm like yours? So walk us through it. What's the process of working with Hush, and what can somebody expect?
So we try to make it really easy, right? From the first conversation of, I like to protect my privacy, right? Or I've got a risk that I'm dealing with of one kind or the other. It's very simple, right? We send someone an invitation link to our platform. They onboard, which is to say they enter a little bit of information about themselves. None of it is personally identifiable information. We think that's kind of antithetical, right? We don't need your home address or social, the rest. Just an age, maybe a zip code, but some basic information. And then we provide that new member of ours their dashboard, right? That's where they can see their entire digital life. It's that Google times, 10, 15 pages, more than they'll find in a Google search. We have plenty of members who will crack open a bottle of wine and go through their whole life online. They can do that, right? Or if they want to spend, 60 seconds, they can just log on. Poof, here are my vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are going to be things like answers to bank challenge questions, right? Which I never answer accurately. I could never do that. But answers to bank challenge questions, personally identifiable information about kids, travel patterns, right? We have 13 categories that we look for. And we say, look, here are your vulnerabilities. And the average person, like I mentioned, has got 58 of those. Now, everyone's going to have a different level of risk tolerance. Much like investment risk tolerance, everybody's different. There are some people who are naturally concerned and paranoid, and I don't think in a bad way. And there's some people who say, look, I'm just not worried at all, or I'm very much not concerned about these issues, or at least certain issues. And that's fine as well, right? And again, we classify these against financial, physical, and reputational types of data. And then from there, they can literally click on a little button that reads Hush, and they can go through those. If they get bored of clicking, which they often do at 5.4 clicks, there's a remove all button, right? And it just submits all of them for removal. And that's it. They log off. It's done. And then they get updates from us. I wish I could say it was a real-time process. It's not, because we're literally engaging with all these counterparties. So it may take 9 days on average to get those removals to start coming through. Some of them happen as little as a few hours. Others will take months, because we really have to go to the mat, right, with whatever counterparty it is. But the information does come down, right? We're very successful in getting things off the internet, the erasing part that I mentioned. And that's it. We often say, hey, add your family, right? Because while you may have, a limited footprint, what about your spouse partner, right? I remember the story of a CEO client who was very much locked down, right? Didn't think he had much of a profile. But it turns out that his wife had very much a profile, as did their dog.
Oh, wow.
Online. And that was where all of the information was on that particular individual. So it's a family consideration. But again, all this is done by technology and very easy.
I'm glad you mentioned the pet, by the way, because lots of us have pets who have their own Instagram account, and the pet is posting all sorts of stuff about where they are and what they they like to eat and all that type of stuff.
Look, we know there are criminals who zoom in on the photograph and the dog tag to see where the dog lives.
Oh, that's interesting. I never even thought of that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I guess, if you're really diligent, it's so funny. So my wife's uncle, was that my uncle-in-law or something like that? Anyway, he's worked for the NSA, and this is post World War II era, and he used to tell me all the ways that they would find out information. And one time was like they identified a specific church bell in the background. They had like effectively a database of all church bells in the world, and they were able to like identify like what city that church bell was happening from our audio recording and go like, so these, if people really get diligent about stuff, they can find out lots of crazy details.
They can. Well, and here's the thing, all of that has gotten so much easier with technology lately. Yes. So
Yeah,
it sounds like Cloak and Dagger these days, I suspect, right, with the right data set, less sophisticated people could pull it off.
yeah. So one of the things we started our conversation with was, in your former life at WealthX, you were helping advisors and wealth management firms bring on new clients by helping them get a dossier for prospects. As I think about Hush and the solution you have, I can't help but think that not only is this great for existing clients to bring a new solution to my existing clients and go, hey, we can help you lock down things, be more secure, have better peace of mind, sleep at night factor. That's part of what you're paying us for anyways. Like, that's what we want to do, is help you feel more confident and secure with life. How do you help advisors, or what do you suggest for advisory firms to do to use Hush as part of their sales process, right? As their client acquisition process? Because I could see it very well being something like that I would want to talk to a prospect and say, hey, not only are we going to help you manage your money, but here's another level of we're bringing for you.
Yes. Well, so I think, so a few things on that one. One, as an advisor, it's interesting to be able to say that the advisor works very securely, very privately, right? And so the client can be assured that the advisor themselves won't be an easy mark for criminals, even though they're supporting the individual or the family, right? I go back to the Swiss banker who doesn't carry business cards, for example, right?
Yeah.
There's a legacy of keeping a low profile for a whole lot of reasons. But I think the same can be true of really any service provider these days. I'm reminded of a story I heard recently of a construction company, right, that was serving a family and helping with their renovation. And the construction company's accounts got hacked. And that's how, unfortunately, funds were to be directed to a fraudulent account as a result of that service provider being hacked. An advisor is another service provider. And so being able to say, look, I have gold standard approaches to security myself, right, and can make sure that you're protected as well, makes a big difference. So that's just one thing on the trust trajectory is, yes, I'm doing all the things I can as an advisor to make sure that we are secure, and thus by extension, your relationship is with us. And I can tell you a story of an advisor who was conned at a large institution for over $1 million with litigation pending, right, as a result of that loss. So there are real reasons, right, for advisors to think that way. The next is the cost of what we do is relatively low, right? And in fact, I'd argue quite low, certainly from an ROI perspective, where we have organizations who will simply give Hush, right, to their clients because they say, look, this is just one more protection. It just makes sense, right, to have this capability for yourself and your family. It's one more way, to your point, you can sleep easier at night. That works well. And then lastly is, certainly the conversations of just the awareness, the briefings, let us help and guide. And if you have any questions about, hey, you're going through a liquidity event, which is a common one, right? They will be a target. When the press release goes out about the company being sold, regardless if it has a dollar amount in there or not, that family is now a target. For the run-of-the-mill trip, I'm not talking about Hollywood, just the run-of-the-mill identity thieves trying to get their way in to make some money and a score. They're now an elevated target. What are you doing for them? Are you even asking the question about how they think about that problem, right? Or waiting until it happens? So all of this is in part of most likely risk they're going to face in the near term is around cybercrime somehow. What are you doing to support them, right, as their advisor?
I love it. I love it. Super smart stuff. What's the delicate way to ask? What's the appropriate high net worth level of a client for an advisor to be recommending Hush to them? Because I don't know, like, is it somebody who has $10 million? Is it somebody who, should they be north of $50 million? Or is it anybody who you would consider high net worth should be working with Hush?
That's a great question. So there's a few ways to look at it. We often find that with Hush, and look, our objective is to be able to scale this so that anyone in the US has access to Hush. It's those with the least means that are least able to handle their identity being stolen, their accounts being drained, and so forth, right? So arguably, if someone who's got $1 million of net worth or 5 million, they will be okay, right? This will be an unfortunate event, but they will get through it. But there certainly is elevated risk there. So generally speaking, I'd say if someone is thoughtful enough to go through, let's say, even the estate planning process, right, and worry about ensuring that they're mitigating risk in a reasonable way, or having an umbrella approach to their insurance, that's probably the right level. And those people would say would kick in at $500,000, $1 million, right? So high
Yeah.
net worth levels. But when you get into ultra high net worth, it's a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
The risks are compounded substantially, including for family members, and it's a matter of time. It's not if, it's when.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, this has been fantastic. So people are going to want to follow up with you. GoHush.com. You're also on LinkedIn. Where else are you hanging out? Where's some planned speaking events or any other awesomeness you're putting out into the world that people should follow along with you?
You're very kind. For operational security reasons, we never say where we're going in advance. Yes.
We have the tactical team on the ground first before you get there.
Yes. So we are at events, definitely. I'd say LinkedIn, to your point, we're there certainly, and others. Yes.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you carving out the time to come on the show, Mykolas. I loved it. I'm sure we'll have you on the show or some other show at some point in time in the future as well. Thank you very much.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you very much for listening to and or watching this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor podcast. It's always fantastic to have you with us. Huge thanks to Mykolas Rambus from Hush for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Every once in a while, I meet somebody who, it's kind of an interesting thing. Maybe you have this every once in a while where you meet them and you're so impressed with them. You're just like, this guy is like next level smart. And I really love what he's working on. And I hope he'll come on the show because I can't wait to chat with him about something. And he graciously agreed to do so. And really, really appreciative for Mykolas for coming on the show. So thank you, buddy. Really appreciate it. Welcome back anytime. As I said at the top of the show, make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your preferred podcast platform or over on YouTube. And do me a favor, share it on LinkedIn or, X or Threads or wherever you're hanging out on the internet. Let other people know about this. I think this is really important information, okay? That's all I have for you today. Do me a favor. Be nice to each other. We'll see you next time on the Financial Advisor Podcast. See you. Bye.